So let's talk about France. Not my favorite subject to talk about in history, but relevant to today. So in 1789, we're talking about the bread tax is the question here. In 1789, these causes for the French Revolution. One, bread was a big cause for the French Revolution. Bread is life. The Romans understood this. Bread and games, that keeps the people happy, right? And bread is life. And in France, the average Frenchman would pay half of his daily wage on bread. It was a staple of their diet. Bread fed them, fed their families. That's what they needed, right? So half your daily wage is going to bread to feed your family. And in 1788 and 1789, the grain crops fail in France. And all of a sudden, there's not enough bread to go around. And the price of bread shoots up 88%. And so the people that need bread to live and survive, they can't find their food. And so they get upset. They riot. They start going outside the palace of Versailles and in Paris, and they're chanting, bread, bread, bread. And what does Marie Antoinette allegedly say? Let them eat cake. And this, even though she didn't probably actually say that, this sets them off. And they storm the Bastille. And then they get King Louis and they get Marie. And eventually it's off with their heads. And the French Revolution is on. That's a big part of it. But there's also a second part. And that's salt. So bread and salt. There was a salt tax in France. And this salt tax existed since like the 1300s, 1340, when King Philip VI, the Handsome, instituted the first permanent salt tax in France. And what this did is it would require citizens to purchase salt every year. They had to buy it. And they had to buy like 7 kilograms of salt a year. And the rates were different in different parts of the country, but the requirement still existed. You had to buy this salt. It would be bought up by the granaries. It would be put in the royal granaries and then resold at a markup to the common people. And so they had to buy this salt that was marked up, and that was to enrich the king and the nobility and the first and second estates, because they were exempted. The first and second estates, the clergy, the nobility, and government officials were exempted from the tax. So that meant the tax fell on everyone else, the common folk, the average Frenchman and Frenchwoman. That's who had to pay the salt tax. And this had existed since the 1300s. But by 1789, things are already so bad. There's not enough bread. Now they got to pay hard-earned money to buy salt that they can't even use the way they want to use, because if they use it improperly and commit salt fraud, they can go to jail or worse. And so all of these things lead to the French Revolution. And there's more to it than that, but these are two primary drivers to the discontent of the people. The third estate is being taxed unfairly in comparison to the first and second estate. And there's a food shortage, and the response to the people's cries for food is let them eat cake, is indifference. That's what it is, right? That's what leads to the French Revolution here, right? And so let's apply that to today. And it's interesting because in 1956, France had another bread issue where the bakers in France, and there's like 45,000 of them at this time in 1956, rioted and went on strike because the government wouldn't allow them to make enough money. They were only making like 14 cents a pound for a pound of bread, and they wouldn't let them make more money to sell their bread. And they actually went on strike, and it was a whole fiasco in the 50s. Bread is life. You have bread, the people are happy. But if you move that to today, and now we're talking about America and the proposed tariffs, as the commenter has asked, what are the similarities? Well, I think there's similarities, one, in our tax system, right? Where people that are middle class or lower class or working class, they see an unfair tax system. They see the wealthy, the rich, finding all these loopholes to avoid paying taxes. They see capital gains being unrealized and not being taxed, and they don't think it's fair, or people are able to divest their wealth in ways that they can avoid taxes, right? And so they see an unfair tax burden being placed on them, whereas the rich just keep getting richer, right? And I think that's one big part of it. Another part with the tariffs, is there's a misunderstanding of what a tariff will do. So if a country exports a good to America, let's say China exports raw materials to America, a company in America will buy those raw materials, use them to make whatever product they're making, and then sell them. Well, if there's a tariff applied, China's not hurt by that tariff being applied, okay? Because they're still going to sell the good to the company that's importing it. The company that purchases the good pays the tariff, and then they pass the cost of that tariff onto whatever finished product they're selling to the consumer in America. And so that added cost gets passed on to us. And it could amount to $3,000, $4,000, $5,000 per year in added costs. So when Harris was saying it was a tax, that's what she was saying. It was a tax on us. China's not paying that tariff. Any country that exports to us isn't paying that tariff. And this pipe dream that this is just going to spur this manufacturing boom in America, that we're all of a sudden we're going to start making our own t-shirts again, right? We're going to start making our own toys again, or computers again, or whatever, cell phones. All that stuff is made out of the country. And we don't have the infrastructure to suddenly just start building those things again. So you're going to pay those tariffs. We are going to pay those tariffs. And it's going to impact us a whole lot more than it's going to impact the 1%. 3,000, 4,000 bucks is nothing to them. 3,000, 4,000 bucks to me, to you, that's massive. That determines if somebody can make a car payment. That determines if somebody can put food on the table. That determines a whole lot. If they can keep the lights on, if they can pay the rent, pay the mortgage. 3,000, 4,000 bucks a year to the average working class American, that's a big, big cost. It's not a big cost to the rich. They'll be fine with the tariffs. They can handle it. But us, that adds up real fast. And so I think there are similarities between 1789 France and, America today. I don't think it's one for one. It's not apples and apples. But there are enough similarities where you can see if those at the top, the first estate and the second estate, are profiting off the work and extortion of the third estate, the average working man and working woman, that leads to social discontent. And then if you do, what you do is you add a tariff to that, not just targeted tariffs, but universal tariffs on any imports, that could bankrupt a big part of our country, a big part of our population. And if you do that, you're going to have people in the streets chanting bread, bread, bread. And what's the government's response going to be to that? That's the big question. Have a great day in history.